Identity politics. What's the real reason that it's tearing our culture apart? I spoke to Jordan Peterson about it. His answer will blow your mind. Hello there, you 6.5 million awakening wonders. Thanks for joining me on this voyage to truth and freedom. Turn on the notification bell and subscribe right now. You know what we're interested in is bringing people together, having conversations that are difficult with people that you don't agree with on everything, but you do agree with on some things, respecting alternative views, finding new ways to cooperate and collaborate to bring about the maximum amount of freedom for the maximum number of people, respecting the opinions of people you disagree with and finding ways that we can work together. It's always fantastic to talk to the great Dr. Professor Sultan Jordan Peterson, and whenever I speak to him, I always want to ask him questions that challenge my own understanding and hopefully challenge his. He was kind enough to say they're some of the hardest questions he's ever been asked. I think he said something like that. I might be exaggerating. I don't know. I exaggerate sometimes. But my favorite part of the conversation, which is available in its entirety in the other place, there's a link in the description if you want to see it, was the bit where he said that prior to sex, biological entities could evolve independently, i.e. amoeba through self-subdivision, and there are types of lizards to this day that can procreate without a partner. He said that the point of sex was to avoid parasites, literal biological parasites, but he talks a lot about predators, parasites, hosts, and we use that as a jumping off point to talk about identity politics, its significance and its power. In short, are we infatuated with sexual identity and identity too much? And what are the costs and consequences if indeed that's true? Have a look at this conversation. You're going to love it.
It appears to me sometimes, Jordan, that anthropology and ethnographics suggest that we ought live in manageable communities where the kind of narcissism and sadism that you describe cannot thrive because of the way that relationships break down when you encounter personalities of that type. There is no ability to regulate a culture at this kind of scale. And I know that what you believe in, it seems at least to me, that you believe in new ways of decentralizing power, both corporate and state. I wonder, are you saying something as significant as the nation project has had its demi-millennia and that it's time to review even the findings and the treasures of the Westphalian Treaty? Is this a time where we review the way that we organize cultures and society? Because it appears to me that the reason that we have these great gargoyles and demons occupying the public stage, vivid caricatures, a vile, lurid and pornographic language, even outside of the erotic, is precisely because we are living in some outgrowth, in some exaggeration, in some unbearable amplification of the type of systems that we might live by. Industrialization, it seems, ultimately introduced a great deal of tyranny as well as the miracles it delivered. Agriculture, perhaps the same could be said, but we have no contingency for the problems of scale that have been created by this new type of technology. And it seems to me that unless we introduce real measures, as you say, control mechanisms, that the tyranny now is appearing to be inevitable without significant and organized opposition.
Okay, so one of the things you said at the beginning of that was that when you extract relationships out of their local environment, you lose a regulatory function. You lose an implicit regulatory function. So imagine that, you and I have had multiple opportunities to communicate. And one of the things, and we want to sustain that. So one of the things that we do while we're communicating, we might be trying to make our individual points for our own particular purposes. Hopefully, we're trying to do something like investigate the truth, mutually. But in any case, even if our own personal interests did creep into that, if we had any sense, our exchanges would be bounded by the realization that we're going to interact repeatedly for an indefinite amount of time into the future, right? And so that makes us instantly, the dyad that we form, that makes us instantly into an interacting and iterative community. Now, I believe that it's out of iterative interactions that fundamental morality emerges. And there's plenty of game theory that indicates precisely that. Now, see what happens to psychopaths and predators and parasites is that they sacrifice the possibility of a long-term relationship for immediate gratification. And that's not good for them, by the way, because they tend to be very unsuccessful people and they have to move from victim to victim very rapidly because people cotton on to their games. but they're not bounded by that necessity of responsible, iterated interaction, the same necessity that would govern you if you were in a long-term committed relationship or the relationship that you have with your children. And it's out of that morality springs. Now, if you eradicate that necessity, you disinhibit the psychopaths now, and the predators and the parasites. Now, here's why this is such a major problem, and it might be a deadly problem. So the biological struggle is an arms race between parasites and hosts, and always has been. And it's such a profound race that's why sex evolved. Sex evolved because there are creatures that replicate, even some lizards that can replicate essentially by cloning themselves. So they produce identical duplicates of themselves. But what happens is the parasites can optimize for their physiology and take them out. So sex mixes genes. Okay, so the reason I'm saying that is because the parasite problem is so deep and so profound that sex itself evolved as the method of replication to deal with it. Now, the online communication systems facilitate the parasites, and you don't need that many of them to take a society down. Like the real radical types who would rather dance around in the chaos and who are in it only for their immediate self-gratification. They're a very small percentage of the population. Clinical data indicates about 3%. But the problem with that is that if they have free rein, they can take everything down. Like they did that in the Russian Revolution, for example. This happens.
Do you sense in identity politics a further fetishization of individualism that can no longer really be sustained? That rationalism has brought us to this point where all of our functions tend to be predicated on the service of our preferences and our aversions, that our individual likes and dislikes become our Quran, they become our religion. And do you feel, Jordan, that partly what you are trying to do is reintroduce transcendent spiritual ideas to a cultural conversation that is bereft in them and is framed only really within the lexicon of materialism and the tropes of post-Enlightenment philosophy that really doesn't embrace mysticism the way that perhaps it could? And within this idea around identity politics and it being a kind of the ultimate celebration of the individual, that it has baked into it kind of is preventative of unity almost in the way that it defines itself. Could you also touch upon this attack perhaps on nature's self, and within that masculinity? I know it's an idea you've talked about extensively, but in relation to identity politics in particular.
Okay, so interesting. It's very interesting, Russell. One of the things that Carl Jung intimated near the end of the Second World War was that the fundamental danger of Protestantism as such was the continual fragmentation of the religious enterprise. And you see this with the multiplication of Protestant sects, let's say. And he thought that the ultimate extension of that would be that each individual, in some sense, would become their own church. And so when God identifies himself to Moses in Exodus, he says, I am that I am, or I am what I am. He identifies himself as the principle of being and becoming itself. All right. Now, if you identify reality with your subjective experience only, you attribute to yourself that quality. I am the ultimate arbiter of what constitutes reality. But there's a weird twist in that, and it's one that I don't exactly understand, because the subjectivity to which all things are to be subordinated tends to be allied with an extremely narrow hedonism. And so the people who are pushing forward an identity politics seem to identify their own individuality with nothing more, let's say, than their immediate sexual desire. And I would say sexual particularly because so much of identity politics is about sexual attraction. And then you might say, well, it's a pretty strange theory of human existence that you are to be identified with one biological whim, let's say. And the unity that you're describing, I don't even think in some sense is metaphysical or transcendent. I think what it is the hammering into a higher order unity of the plethora of fundamental motivational and emotional systems that would otherwise manifest themselves as a pure local subjectivity. And if that happens, you run into the psychopath problem. Like if you're only out, let's say you identify yourself with your desires, your immediate desires. Well, then you're going to treat everyone around you and yourself like a means to the gratification of those immediate desires. And what that will do is that'll destroy you in the future because you're not giving your future self any allowance. You do terrible things now because they're pleasurable, regardless of consequences. And you treat everyone else as if they're lesser and subordinate to your whims. This higher unity, it isn't less real than the subordinate whims. It's more real. Like the hero archetype is the most real representation of the human self. It's the most real. And it's based on the idea of something approximating courageous self-sacrifice. So, for example, you see in the dragon fight story, the notion that you have to confront what you're terrified of and repelled by. You have to do that voluntarily. The more assiduously you pursue that, the bigger the treasure you garner. If you garner the treasure, you're obligated to distribute it generously to the community. And it's all of that that makes up that central archetype of the hero. And that is the central unity, right? That unites the individual internally, unites motivation and emotion, and then unites each individual with the community.
A sense that the hero cannot be mobilized or galvanized without that motivation, that the fuel doesn't arrive until the hero it transcends from egoic motivation to communal motivation, that when fueled by the ego, you cannot confront the dragon sufficiently. There's a few things that I want to pick up on, and this is this idea, if I may, sir, of utility. That when we see other only in terms of utility, it's obviously restrictive. But I would love to fold into this one of the things you taught us earlier in the conversation, the role of sex in our evolution, and indeed all of evolution, in order to introduce new complexity. If sex has such an epochal role in the evolution of our entire species, surely then it is connected to this consciousness that is ulterior to manifestation and materialization, and therefore its role is almost archetypically significant. I also want to offer you this, if I may, regarding the Cain and Abel analysis. There has to be an ongoing tension between the assertion of our roles as individuals. We have to exist. I have to exist as Russell in the world. I have to know that it is Russell's mouth that I put food into, rather than the mouths of others on the most basic biological level. That I am indeed, that my entire reality is subjective. That is all I know of reality, and yet I am aware of my insignificance. Somewhere within us, there is some fractal interface between our relative insignificance and our total if not omnipotent, omniscience, that all reality takes place within my consciousness, yet materially I'm borderline irrelevant. Perhaps there is something of this Cain and Abel tension here. I believe that if people don't have a felt and personal subjective experience of God, whether that's through Christ or the Prophet Muhammad or Buddha, or yogically, some sense of a self beyond self, or some sense of an entity beyond self, some felt experience of knowing that is not about what Russell wants and what Russell doesn't want, then we do become victim to this hedonic ideology that seems to assert itself in the absence of a more deliberate ideology. I've been thinking too of the distinction between bliss and ecstasy. Bliss perhaps offers us the idea of fulfillment. Our cup is full. Ecstasy offers us the idea that my cup runneth over, that boundaries are being burst. This seems to me relevant with your hedonic analysis. So I say that when we strip away God and the possibility of God, then that subjective experience becomes God. That becomes the higher principle around which we organize. So there does need to be some new way of introducing to politics sacredness, the sacrament, the idea, somehow the representation of this tension, that we are part of the divine, that we have rights, but we are not only our rights, we are also our duties. I know that's not a question, but I also know you'll have things to say.
Well, okay, so there is a gospel injunction as well to render unto Caesar what is Caesar's and unto God what is God's. And you you mentioned a reintroduction of the sacred into the political. And what has happened, as you also intimated, is that the sacred has collapsed into the political. And that means there are now sacred cows in the political, which is why we can't discuss politics with each other. You need to separate the sacred and the political has to be subordinate to the sacred. I mean, this is one of the most remarkable and powerful discoveries of mankind as a whole, is that the principle of political sovereignty has to be subordinate to the principle of sacred sovereignty. And the Christian idea, and this develops out of the Jewish tradition, is that the fundamental principle of sovereignty is, what would you say, is voluntary. It's voluntary. It's a voluntary sacrifice. That's what's at the center of the community, and that the highest is properly devoted to serving the lowest. That's an inversion of the let's say, the classical notion of power. Might makes right if I can crush you. And if might isn't the principle of sovereignty, you have to ask yourself, well, what is? And you could say, well, nothing, in which case you have a kind of nihilistic chaos, and then hedonism rules. And if there's something sovereign above power, then you have to ask yourself what that is. And that is exactly what the biblical corpus, by the way, is trying to sort out. So you see prophets, for example, emerging repetitively in the Old Testament, and they are people who, what would you say, they evince faith that the fundamental structure of reality is good, and that if you live in truth, you can bring about a new reality that's even better. That's the axiom of faith. Then they'll confront, let's say, the tyrant or the catastrophes of the natural world with that banner in hand and revitalize. And the biblical narrative is predicated on the idea that the Christian Savior is the ultimate expression of that developing spirit, right? The manifestation of that, the embodied manifestation of that.
I hope you enjoyed that conversation. Let me know in the comments and the chat. Give this video a thumbs up and share it around. If you enjoyed this video, please have a look at either of these. More important than that, though, is if you can, please stay free.